everyone, the doctor is in, and today we're going to talk about the basic concepts of metabolism for the subject biochemistry. Our target is at the end of this lecture, you will be able to define what is an anabolic pathway, a catabolic pathway, and an amphibolic pathway. Also, for you to be able to outline the basic chemical pathways or metabolic pathways in the body and how are the flux of the metabolites through the pathway and what are being produced in the pathway and what are the supply of the metabolic fuels needed for that specific pathway. So in this photo, it shows us picture or a diagram with no labels on it. When you're trying to study biochemistry, it's really difficult. Ito yung isa sa mga naging mahirap na subjects when I was in med school, to the point that I had a very low score and I wanted to cry because it was the first time that I wanted to cry because of that very difficult exam I had. So learning biochemistry is like reading Chinese characters for the first time and you don't really understand it that much. So hopefully with our lectures, you will be able to have very brief and not brief, but it's concise concept of the different topics of biochemistry, and the most important things that you should learn will be discussed. So when we talk about metabolism class, this is the sum of all chemical reactions in a cell, tissue, or the whole body. So it's a sum of all chemical reactions. This is why we are alive, because of these chemical reactions that occur simultaneously in the body, occurring non-stop. They can either be catabolic or anabolic. We'll define that more in the next slides. Metabolism is the interconversion of chemical compounds in the body. So the different individual molecules will take certain pathways which will cause these chemical compounds to be converted to one or the other. So there is an interrelationship, and these mechanisms that regulate the outflow of metabolite through the pathways. There are mechanisms that regulates the outflow of these metabolites through the pathways. So metabolism, this is an entire network of chemical reactions carried out in the living cells, and these thousands of chemical reactions occur simultaneously in the body. Now, each reaction will be controlled. We have to understand that each reaction will have to be controlled, making sure that we don't have unwanted accumulation or deficiencies of intermediates or products. Because if there are unwanted accumulations of these products or there is a deficiency of these products, it will lead to a certain pathologic condition depending on what product or substrate is in excess or is deficient. Ganun talaga, class. Hindi pwedeng may kulang, hindi mo pwedeng ibigay ng kulang, hindi mo rin pwedeng ibigay ng sobra. Kasi kung sobra, hindi rin siya magiging maganda para sa atin. So, dapat nasa sapat lang tayo parati. Okay? So, next in this slide, I'm trying to show you, this is an illustration of the majority of biochemical reactions of the body. So, glycolysis, the pentose phosphate pathway, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the urea cycle. These are all basic biochemical reactions in the body. And I want you to take note, class, that there are 3 common junctions in this pathway. Ibig sabihin, this is one common substrate or product in all of the pathways in our body. So, tatlo yun, we have glucose 6-phosphate. You also have pyruvate and acetyl-CoA. So, take note of that. Glucose 6-phosphate, pyruvate, and acetyl-CoA. Now, metabolism is the totality of an organism's chemical reactions that arises from interactions between molecules within the cell. So, I want also to emphasize on this slide that here we see glucose 6-phosphate as a substrate, and the product of one of this reaction, which is fructose 6-phosphate, will be actually the substrate for the subsequent reaction. So it's really a pathway. You cannot move on to the next step without having the step before you. So the product of one reaction is the substrate of the subsequent reaction. So in this reaction, from glucose 6-phosphate, it produces the product of fructose 6-phosphate, which is then now the substrate for the next chemical reaction. Now, in the classification of metabolic pathways class, we need to understand what anabolic mean. So this is the synthesis of compound from smaller raw materials. Okay, now we encounter the term endergonic. When we say endergonic, this means this requires the absorption of energy. In this pathway, if it's an anabolic pathway, it means it will use energy. And when you say divergent, on the other hand, it means, class, that they develop in different directions. So it will start in small raw materials and it will develop into larger products or larger or more complex chemical compounds. So for example, here we have protein synthesis, okay? From an amino acid, it will develop into a protein, triglyceride synthesis, and glycogenesis, the formation of glycogen. When you see the suffix genesis, it means the beginning or the creation, right? So glycogen creation or production. So I hope we understand what anabolic means. So simply it means to build. Anabolic is to build something from a small raw material. Catabolic, on the other hand, this is like, try to understand catabolic. Let's exchange it with letter U, cut. When you cut something, you break down this object into two smaller molecules. So catabolic, that's how you remember it. It will break down larger molecules into smaller ones. So this is usually an oxidative reaction. Now, we encounter the term exergonic. So when we say exergonic, in this process, you will release energy. You're not going to require energy, but you're going to release the energy. And also, it is a convergent process. It means coming close together. Okay, so convergent. So it produces reducing equivalents and adenosine triphosphate, ATP, mainly via the respiratory chain. So it produces energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate. So let's look at the term of, or the pathways that are catabolic in nature. So glycolysis. Lysis means to destroy something or to break it down or to kill it. So lysis, pinaghihiwa-hiwalay mo siya. So what is being lysed here is glycogen. So glycolysis, it is a catabolic process. So in other words, it destroys or it breaks it down. Next is beta oxidation. This is for the fats. And then glycogenolysis. Look at the terms, class. First, in anabolic, you're going to produce it. So it's called glycogenesis. Here in the catabolic process, you would like to destroy it or break it down into smaller pieces. So it's called glycogenolysis. The root word is glycogen. So this is the product that will be broken down. And then we have lysis. Okay? So anabolic is to build, catabolic is to destroy. So A, B, C, D. Anabolic, build, catabolic, destroy. That's my mnemonic. Okay. Next, we have amphibolic. Amphibolic, on the other hand, class, this is the crossroads of metabolism. It is a link between anabolic and catabolic pathways. So it links them. And an example of this is the citric acid cycle. So this will be discussed to you by in another lecture, but this is the link. It is amphibolic in nature. So if we talk about intermediary metabolism, on the other hand, it is applied to reactions involving low molecular weight molecules that are metabolites of the degradation or biosynthesis of biopolymers. Energy metabolism, on the other hand, is part of the intermediary metabolism, which consists of pathways that store or generate metabolic energy. That's why it's called energy metabolism. It will store and generate metabolic energy. Para kang nag-iipon ng energy. So most organisms derive both raw materials and energy from organic fuel molecules such as glucose. So that is energy metabolism. So in this next slide, we see here the 3 stages of catabolism. So breaking down, destroying. So the first stage is you're going to break down complex molecules first to their component building blocks. You have to know that the building blocks of protein are amino acids, and breaking it down to amino acids is just the first step of catabolism. Starch, on the other hand, is broken down into simple sugars, or single sugars rather, and lipids are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. So these three here are the building blocks. Now, what's the next stage? The next stage would entail the conversion of these building blocks to acetyl-CoA or other simple intermediates. So we have here amino acids will be converted into acetyl-CoA, even your single sugars, and fatty acids or glycerol. But in the process of converting single sugars to acetyl-CoA, it will already produce an adenosine triphosphate and release carbon dioxide. So meron na kaagad na produce ng energy from starch. Now, once they become or converted to acetyl-CoA, the third step would be the metabolism of this acetyl-CoA to carbon dioxide and formation of adenosine triphosphate. So, we produce energy. Ito yung tinatawag natin kaninang exergonic process. You release energy in the form of ATP. So, acetyl-CoA will release energy through the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain. Remember, we said amphibolic. The citric acid cycle is amphibolic, meaning it is a crossroad. So from a catabolism, meron siyang crossroad. This is the amphibolic pathway. Okay. Now, how do we know, or when does normal metabolism occur versus abnormal metabolism? So in the periods of adaptation in different cases, this is where normal metabolism occur. Example, during starvation, gutom na gutom ka na, you haven't eaten for 3 days or drank water for 3 days or more than that. During exercise, especially during strenuous exercise, we'll have a period of normal metabolism. During pregnancy, where the fetus will be needing a lot of energy, and of course also during lactation. Now, when we talk about abnormal metabolism, on the other hand, this will result from nutritional deficiency. So, even without these factors of starvation, no exercise, you're not pregnant or breastfeeding, but the source of nutrients are deficient, it means you're not eating. You're eating, but there is no nutrient in what you are eating, then it will result to abnormal metabolism. Another is enzyme deficiency. This enzyme deficiency may be congenital, or it may also occur due to lack of that enzyme that is in the diet. So enzyme deficiency is also, or the precursor to that enzyme rather, is deficient in the diet. So magkakaroon din tayo ng abnormal metabolism. Also, abnormal secretion of hormones, which it may be caused by another pathology, will also cause abnormal metabolisms. And of course, we have external factors such as drugs and toxins that may lead to abnormal metabolism. Okay, here, for example, we have a 70-kilogram adult. A 70-kilogram adult will require about 8 to 12 millijoules per day, or 1,920 kilocalories. So how is this being met, this need for an adult for an energy? So this is met from carbohydrates, which is 40 to 60% from carbohydrates. We have 30 to 40% from lipids, which are mainly triacyl glycerols, and 10 to 15% from proteins. So pinakamataas, highest, is that of the carbohydrate. Now, an average physical activity, your normal physical activity, will increase metabolic rate by 40 to 50% over the resting metabolic rate. So if you compare your metabolic rate while you are at rest as compared to doing an average physical activity, not a very heavy one, it will increase your metabolic rate to 40 to 50%. So also, the body will need to form reserves in between meals. If this energy is not being used, it will be created as a reserve. For example, for carbohydrate, it will be converted into a food reserve, which is, or energy reserve, which will be called glycogen. It is produced as a reserve and stored in the liver and muscle. Take note, class, where is it stored? In the liver and in the muscle. Lipid, on the other hand, is reserved in the form of triacetylglycerol, and these are stored in adipose tissue. Okay, now talking about storage of adipose tissue, we now talk about what we call obesity. So from this lean body to this body with a lot of stored fat. So if the intake of our metabolic fuel is, take note of the term, consistently greater than our energy expenditure, meaning we eat a lot of carbohydrates or containing high energy source, whether that's protein or fat or carbohydrate, and it is consistently greater. Every day we eat burger, fries, bread, cake, then we don't exercise. So what will happen? We will have surplus or excess, and this will be stored largely as triacylglycerols in adipose tissue, now developing obesity. On the other hand, we have what we call class emaciation. So now if the intake or the metabolic fuels are consistently lower, on the other hand, than the energy expenditure required, then this will be the effect. This is what we call emaciation. So we can already see, nakikita mo na yung ribs, diba? Ito yung tinatawag nating gitara when we were younger. So there are negligible reserves of fat, very, very negligible, very small reserves of fat. Halos wala na nga. We call this butot balat, right? And even carbohydrate reserves are very negligible. So the amino acids arising from protein turnover are used for energy-yielding metabolism rather than producing proteins via protein synthesis. So these amino acids will be used for energy-producing metabolism rather than for protein synthesis. So this is called emaciation. Now, another thing that you have to understand when we talk about metabolism are the fed and fasting state. There is a time that we are well-fed, busog tayo, or fasting, ilang oras, magugutom tayo. And take note, if during the fed state, of course, there is sufficient amount of energy. So what will we use as metabolic fuel? Most tissues will use glucose. Okay, that's very easy to understand. But what we want to try to learn today is when you are fasting or for how many hours you have not eaten or drunk any water, what will be the source of our body for metabolic fuel or energy? So here in the fasting state, the brain is our priority. Take note, class, the glucose will be spared or ire-reserve yan para sa brain. Kasi it controls our body, right? So it will be largely dependent on glucose. So they are spared for the brain. Another is our red blood cells. Our red blood cell functions to deliver oxygen and other nutrients to the different cells of the body. And take note, class, without glucose, these red blood cells will not be able to function properly. Why? Because they are very, very much reliant on glucose. In fact, they are wholly reliant. They only use glucose. So glucose in RBCs will undergo anaerobic metabolism. Okay, another thing that you need to take note during metabolism are there are tissues that can use fuels other than glucose to do so. So they can use others. So ito naman medyo mas resourceful. Hindi sila mapili. Kumbaga sa bata, they can eat other foods or parang not literally, but just like that's how I compare it. So, for example, the muscle and the liver can oxidize their fatty acids stored to produce glucose. So we call that fatty acid oxidation, which I believe you will be learning in another lectures. So liver synthesis of, also the liver, si liver, parang anti natin yan. Marami siyang alam na mapagkukuhanan ng pagkain. So siya rin yung anti natin na pag pumunta sa handaan, marami siyang inuuwi para meron pa siyang makain kapag wala ng pagkain sa handaan. So that is how I think of the liver. So for example, the liver can also synthesize or produce ketone bodies from fatty acids. Okay? And we have what we call glycogen reserves, and these are used via glycogenolysis to produce glucose. Remember the catabolic process, lysis, we destroy the glycogen, and this will be converted back into glucose. Amino acids are also used for gluconeogenesis. Now, when you see the term, I've mentioned earlier, genesis means production or synthesis. When you see the root word neo, it means new, meaning we are going to use a new source to produce glucose. And what is that new source? It's amino acid. We know amino acid should produce proteins, right? But since we need glucose in a fasting state, we try to look for new sources of glucose, such as the basic or the building block of our protein, amino acid. Next, we have the formation of and utilization of reserve triacyl glycerols and glycogen. They are largely controlled by the hormones, insulin and glucagon. So you have to take note of that. Even if the utilization of these reserves are actually very much needed as soon as possible, these are still being controlled by two hormones, which are insulin and glucagon. So insulin and glucagon regulate the production of glycogen during the fed and the fasting states. So whether to make glycogen or to break down glycogen, they have a very large role. It's very important. So when we talk about diabetes mellitus, it's really one difficult metabolic disorder that we have because it affects insulin. So we have been talking about metabolism and how it produces energy. Its main goal is to produce the person and energy that they can use. So when we talk about energy, the main energy source of cell is no other than adenosine triphosphate. So all the catabolic pathways will result in the production of an energy molecule, which is adenosine triphosphate. Hydrolysis will break the bonds in ATP, releasing energy. Okay, so next, when we talk about metabolic efficiency, we talk about food energy. So food energy, okay, from food, this is converted to adenosine triphosphate with approximately 50% efficiency. So from what we eat, the other 50% is released as heat. Siguro, that's why when we eat, for example, when we eat pansit, Valor 100, tapos madaming sebolyat, di ba? 50% of it will be considered converted to energy, while 50% will be released as heat. Maybe that's why we perspire a lot when we eat, right? Okay, now, having known the different metabolic pathways and what are the types of the metabolic pathways, we also have to understand how is it being regulated. What regulates it? So when we are talking about regulation, class, take note, the overall flux through a pathway is important to ensure appropriate supply of products of the pathway. That means you have to be able to provide the right amount of substrate so that you will also get the appropriate supply of the product. Because if the substrate is deficient, you won't be able to produce the product, right? If you want, it's also like how you want to become a doctor and how you want to become a good grade, how you want to have good grades. If you don't give much, you won't have much in return. If you don't listen to this lecture or to any other lecture, if you don't review, if you just lie down in bed while listening to lecture or not listen to the lecture at all, you don't read your books, there's no much effort given, then what will you expect? The output will also be the same. You will not pass your subject nor the board exam. But if you give the appropriate supply of the products, then you will have what you want. You will become a doctor. Okay? So, the regulatory enzymes are which catalyzes the key reactions in the pathway. When we say catalyze, they hasten or they make it faster. These reactions are made faster because of this regulatory enzyme. So, they are very important. Now, in this reaction, we see here a non-equilibrium reaction or potential control of points. So A to B are equilibrium reactions. So why? Because there are two arrows. So equilibrium reaction, it means equal substrate. If there is a good substrate, number of substrate, then we have good products or appropriate supply of the products. As well as letters or reactions C to D are also equilibrium reactions. But take note, B to C is a reaction that is non-equilibrium. So meaning here, heat is being released. So these are potential of control points. So now we talk about the availability of substrate A. It will depend on the supply from the blood, from the food intake, and the transport of this substrate A into the cell. So this substrate A, since this is where the reaction will start, it has to be made available in the blood, whether it's through your food intake, and it has to be transported. So if there's a problem in supply and problem in the transport, then there will be a problem in the availability of our substrate. Next important thing in regulation is the removal of end product D. It has to be used in order for it not to accumulate. Okay, availability of cofactors X and Y as well. So there are different cofactors that are needed during a metabolic pathway, and you'll learn about that later. Those are the things that you have to ask. Tatanungin mo, ano ba ang substrate? Anong product ng pathway na to? Ano ang cofactors needed? So next, enzymes catalyzing non-equilibrium reactions are often allosteric proteins subject to rapid reactions of feedback or feed-forward, controlled by allosteric modifiers in response to the need of the cell. As mentioned earlier, these non-equilibrium reactions are actually potential control points rather. Okay, so having discussed the different types of metabolism, we now talk about the different types of the regulators of metabolism. How are our metabolism being regulated? So we have here intracellular regulation, within the cell. Intercellular is between cells, okay, between cells. And we have also what we call second messenger systems. So intracellular cells are signals coming from within the cell, and substrate availability, and it causes substrate availability and product inhibition. So meron tayong tinatawag na allosteric activators and inhibitors also for our intracellular regulators. Intracellular, on the other hand, will communicate between cells and through the following. It could be direct contact through gap junctions. So I know you have learned about this in physiology and in the early part of biochemistry. Could also be through synaptic signaling through neurotransmitters. We use synapse. And endocrine signaling using hormones. So it travels through the bloodstream. Okay. Next are second messengers. These are another type of regulating metabolism. So when we talk about second messengers class, these are intracellular signaling molecules. So within the cell, they are released by the cell in response to exposure to an extracellular signaling molecules called the first messenger. So kaya siya tinawag na second messenger because there is a first messenger. In this picture, we see here a hormone, which is the first messenger. So this hormone traveled through the bloodstream, connected through the receptor, and in the receptor, there is a chemical reaction produced until such time that the second messenger camp is activated, and this second messenger will cause chemical reactions inside the cell. So this inactive protein kinase will be activated, and it will trigger a response of the target cell. It will either activate an enzyme, it will stimulate a cellular reaction, or open an ion channel. So that's how our metabolism is regulated, through second messengers. So there should be a first messenger before a second messenger can be activated and before the triggered response is produced. So intracellular signaling, which is a non-local form of cell signaling encompasses both the first messenger and the second messenger. And I want you to take note that both the first and second messengers are classified as juxtacrine, paracrine, or endocrine. And we try to differentiate those terms. So when you see juxtacrine, this secretory cell is adjacent to an effector cell. Juxta, parang magkalapit. It is adjacent to an effector cell. A paracrine cell or a paracrine, on the other hand, is a hormone which affect only in the vicinity of the gland secreting it. So para makapit bahay naman niya, paracrine yung mga nasa tabi niya lang, within the vicinity. Well, when we talk about endocrine hormones, these are producing secretions that are distributed in the body by way of the bloodstream. So even if it comes from a very, very far organ, it will be delivered to that cell because it will travel through the bloodstream. Okay? So juxtacrine, paracrine, and endocrine. So this is a larger picture of what we have seen earlier about the second messenger. So again, there's the first messenger, which is a hormone attaching to the receptor, causes different chemical reactions, then activating the second messenger, which in this case is CAMP, then producing us the trigger response that we want to achieve, or that the body or the cell wants to achieve. So here we have second messengers and the protein kinases of each of the specific second messenger and the examples of the hormones used for this type of second messengers. So we have the cyclic adenosine monophosphate or CAMP. The protein kinase is protein kinase A, and the examples of which are glucagon and epinephrine. We also have IP3, DAG, protein kinase C, and that's for epinephrine. We also have CGMP. Ayan, diba? Kanina yung CAMP, protein kinase A. CGMP is protein kinase G. So ito naman IP3-DAG is protein kinase C. So for CGMP, ito naman is atrial natriuretic peptide, nitric oxide. Tyrosine kinase, on the other hand, ang kanyang protein kinase is tyrosine kinase or JAK-STAT. So insulin-like growth factor, and then intracellular, meron din for glucocorticoids and thyroid hormones. So we have to try to memorize this and understand the relationship of your second messenger with that of the protein kinase. So metabolic fuels, these have been mentioned earlier, but just to give us a review, our sources of fuels are, of course, glucose. We've emphasized on that, fatty acids, amino acids, and ketones. Carbohydrates can be used for the synthesis of fatty acids as well. So carbohydrates it's not just used for the synthesis of glucose, but fatty acids. And take note, acetyl-CoA cannot be used as a substrate for gluconeogenesis. When these pathways will be discussed further, you will understand why. But for now, I want you to understand that acetyl-CoA is not used as a substrate for gluconeogenesis. Propionyl-CoA, on the other hand, can be a substrate for gluconeogenesis as well as glycerol from triacyl glycerols. Now, most of our amino acids will yield pyruvate, which can be carboxylated and carboxylated to oxaloacetate, which is the primary substrate for gluconeogenesis. So meaning, amino acids can be used as a substrate for gluconeogenesis. That's why sabi natin new source of energy, because this amino acid yielding this pyruvate, which is carboxylated to oxaloacetate, can be a substrate for gluconeogenesis. Now, glucogenic, these are amino acids forming substrates for gluconeogenesis. When we say ketogenic, there are also amino acids that give rise to acetyl-CoA, such that in prolonged starvation, these are used for synthesis of ketone bodies in the liver. So on this slide, what we are trying to emphasize is amino acids are very important sources or building blocks, because there are amino acids that are glucogenic, which can form glucose, kaya siya glucogenic, while there are amino acids that can form ketones or fat, That's why it's called ketogenic. So that's your assignment. You have to know what are glucogenic amino acids and ketogenic amino acids as well. Now, glucose is always required by the CNS or by the brain and red blood cells. Our erythrocytes lack mitochondria. They don't have the powerhouses of the cell. So they are very, very much reliant with glycolysis. So anaerobic glycolysis and the pentose phosphate pathway at all times. Now, the brain, on the other hand, since kailangan ma-spare ang glucose for the brain can also metabolize ketone bodies to at least meet 20% of its energy requirements, but the remainder has to be glucose. So yung brain, pwede mo nang bigyan ng other source such as ketones, but majority should be glucose. In pregnancy, the fetus will, on the other hand, require a lot of glucose. So in lactation, they will also require a lot of glucose because of synthesis of lactose. So that ends our lecture on the basic concepts of metabolism. So I just want to end my lecture by sharing to you this. It's in the Big Hero 6 movie, yung si Baymax. Sabi ng owner, I'm not giving up on you. You don't understand yet, but people need you. So let's get back to work. Just like you are medical students, nursing students, or midwifery students, or any other health allied courses that you're taking up. Right now, you don't understand what you could become or what help you could give later on to other people, especially the patients. So don't give up. You have to really do everything you can to reach for that dream. So that ends my lecture. Thank you so much for listening, and hope to see you in the next lecture videos. Thank you and God bless.